Welcome to Comic Crackle. I am your host. Today we'll cover a book I want to tackle the most. When done dirty by Marvel and Stan Lee, Jack Kirby would make the move for Plan B. From demons to gods of a new generation, Jack would bring them to life through his illustration. So listen here, dear viewer, there's much more to offer, so stick around. We'll be back after a word from our sponsor. Okay, so you can't talk about comics in the 70s without talking about this guy. Frederick Wertham was a German-American psychologist that was notorious for writing Seduction of the Innocent. As you might already know, the book details the effects of comic books on children's development. Wertham posited within the book that violence experienced within a child's early development would lead to increased delinquency. Specifically, Wertham focused on violence depicted within media and really honed in on how it's portrayed in comic books. The book made the outlandish claims that due to her strength and independence, Wonder Woman must be a lesbian. Also, due to the fact that Superman exists, it must also call for sub-men. And these sub-men would be criminals and foreign-looking that would justify the existence of a Superman. So all the people that are saying Superman is a fascist, you're getting your opinion from this guy. And last but not least, most notoriously, claim that Batman and Robin are gay lovers and will in turn make the reader gay. You know what? Let's go ahead and prove his theory. Guys? Wertham's primary point was to identify the violence that was depicted within comics, and also to identify the fascistic undertones that would plague the thought of young readers. He thought that the violence depicted would influence the young readers and lead to increased cases of mental illness and crime. To put it into the modern day perspective, this is basically the argument that video games caused violence in the wake of school shootings. Completely unfounded, fabricated anecdotes that don't show factual data. So what did the good old US of A do with this information? Did they happen to peer review it? Maybe even look into the comics and see what Wertham is identifying to be the work of Hitlerites? By the way, he actually did compare the comics industry to Hitler himself. Heavens no! When the people of America sense a moral panic incoming, they get those dirty commies out of there. So senators like Estes Kefauver led the charge to address the claims made by Wertham. They use this as an opportunity to paint comics as a scapegoat for the delinquency in juveniles. The result of this inquisition was the formation of the Comics Code Authority. This basically was utilized as a means for the comics industry to provide censorship over their titles. The formation of the Comics Code led to 15 publishers closing their doors, and EC Comics consolidating all the way down to publishing one book, Mad Magazine. Most horror titles were canceled outright, and the majority of violence that was depicted within the comics were scaled all the way down. Okay, thank you for bearing with me on that. Now we can move on to my favorite topic, Jack Kirby. As spoken about previously dissecting the new gods, Jack Kirby made his move to DC during the height of his name cachet and popularity. After being scorned by Marvel regarding compensation for the work done underneath the Marvel method, Kirby made his jump over to DC Comics. Mark Evanier, former assistant to Jack Kirby and author of Kirby, King of Comics, states within the biography that Carmine Infantino courted Jack Kirby over to DC, promising proper compensation as well as work autonomy. At first, Kirby took over the Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen book, and from there formulated the Fourth World. As detailed within the introduction pages of The Demon, Mark Evanier talks about the creation of Etrigan. He stated that Carmine Infantino came to Jack Kirby asking for Kirby to do books outside of the superhero genre because they felt like superheroes were losing their relevance. The reason that they believe this is because the Comics Code was just recently revised and more horror titles were coming out, as well as adult-centered storytelling. Now that genres outside of superheroes were back on the menu, readers were hungry to get new and fresh takes. At the time that Carmine came to Jack, Jack was already publishing 3 separate titles, doing writing work and penciling. He had little time for any additional work to do. Originally, Kirby asked Infantino if he would be able to bring on additional artists to take over his work on the Fourth World books, which immediately Infantino shot down. His reason was because the Fourth World books were Kirby books, and DC wasn't sure if readership was going to stick with those titles if Kirby wasn't doing the art. Jack wanted to make the move into an editorial position, overseeing creativity, instead of shackling himself to his desk, which he and Roz Kirby referred to as the dungeon. Infantino promised Kirby that for these additional books, Jack would just have to do the first issue, and then he could oversee them in the creativity process through an editorial position. If I've learned anything about Jack, his fatal flaw was that he didn't know how to say no. So when Infantino asked Kirby to make some new books that have monsters and one that's resembling Planet of the Apes, Kirby makes The Demon and Kamandi because he's the king. There's a really good anecdote that Evanier talks about the formulation of The Demon by Jack, in which DC came to Jack asking for this new book idea on a Friday, and Jack just responded, "It's titled The Demon," with no additional context. When the whole family and his other 2 assistants went out to dinner on that Sunday, Jack was quiet for 15 minutes. From the time that it took to order his burger to it being served to the table, he had formulated the entirety of the first issue of The Demon, as well as incepting the rest of the series. Evanier states, "Had it been anyone else describing a new project in such detail, you would have assumed he'd been working on it for weeks." Paying homage to Hal Foster's Prince Valiant, he modeled Etrigan based on a disguise Valiant dons, using goose skin to form a mask to hide his identity. He quickly worked up the first issues of The Demon and Kamandi, hoping to start his career overseeing creatives in an editorial position. When DC received the first issues, they stated that they would only greenlight these projects if Jack was writing and doing the art for both of these books. The promise of editorial oversight and managing a healthy workload were not kept. To add insult to injury, DC also canceled the Forever People and the New Gods to allow for Kirby to put more effort and time into these new series. While heartbroken about these cancellations, Kirby pressed on. He ended up working on The Demon for 16 issues and Kamandi for 40 total issues. So now that we have the context for the series being created, let's move on to how it's depicted within the pages. The story opens with the fall of Camelot, depicting Morgane Le Fay's siege of the kingdom, with her army taking on the defensive forces of Merlin, attempting to capture the Eternity Book. While the pencils are rendered beautifully, I feel like Kirby is overlooked in his narration. This is how the narration depicts the siege. Beset by overwhelming forces steeped in the workings of the evil sorcery of Morgane Le Fay, the walls of Camelot quaked and shuddered and shot bright flame into the darkest of nights. It was a time when great powers clashed on earth and beyond. The fates were bringing an age to a close. Again and again, the forces in play generated, charged, and struck at the once impregnable Camelot. The new names for them were not yet born, and men still called them magic. For men still lived in the shadow of the old gods, and feared them, even as they did for Morgane Le Fay. It was said that, like Merlin himself, she recruited beings that were not from this earth at all, but from some place outside. But the shocked troops of the enchantress were suddenly stopped and thrown back by an attacker of unequaled ferocity. Legend would say it was a demon in the service of Merlin. There would even be accounts of seeing Merlin rise from the flames and summon this very demon himself. And as the end drew near for Camelot, the fearsome leaping figure of the demon, scaling its doomed towers, was the grim symbol of what was to come. Now look at me in the eyes and tell me that's not the hardest introduction to any character within literature. You can't. In an attempt to ensure LeFay didn't capture the Eternity Book, Merlin forced Etrigan to flee, transforming him into a new human form, only to become the demon again when summoned by Merlin. The human form of Etrigan in the modern day is Jason Blood. He takes on the profession of demonology, specifically researching the paranormal and supernatural. Blood takes on this profession to understand the demon who plagues his thoughts and inner consciousness. Within the story, the explanation for Jason's life is that he adopts new identities, all within his family, to explain his inability to age. LeFay seeks out Blood in an attempt to restore her life through the Eternity Book, and believes that Blood will lead her to Merlin. She hopes to acquire the book and kill Merlin to regain her power and become the supreme sorcerer. Oh, and no relation to the other guy who does magic by copying Spider-Man's hand gestures. It's only when Jason Blood is summoned to return to the ruins of Camelot, at the top of Castle Brannock, is he able to make the first magical girl transformation from heathen to demon, Etrigan. So at this point you might be asking, Merlin? Morgane Le Fay? Aren't those the characters within Arthurian mythology? And I'll tell you this. Will you give me a second and let me get to that? Okay, so Kirby played fast and loose with the stories that he was adapting. I wouldn't even necessarily say that these are adaptations of those characters, and probably more accurately that they're interpolations. Kirby uses iconography that he thinks is cool and then just discards the rest that doesn't apply to the story. Really, I just think that it's Jack Kirby vaguely remembering stories and then just using the archetypes of those characters. One such instance is in issue 8, depicting a man named the Phantom to be a villain that is in love with the statue of a woman named Galatea. In Greek mythology, a king named Pygmalion is turned into a sculptor that falls in love with one of his statues. The goddess Aphrodite brings the statue to life and named her Galatea. The sculptor and his sculpture then marry. A man who falls in love with the sculpture of a woman. Where do I remember that from? Oh, right. Clarion, the witch boy and sworn enemy of myself, is depicted as realistically a stand-in for Loki. He's conniving and constantly scheming for dominance over others. Jack had originally had plans to expand his story for Thor, but once he left Marvel Comics, he took all of those stories and concepts and brought him over to DC. The majority of those stories are depicted within the Fourth World series, but obviously Clarion is a holdover and a stand-in for Loki. And if Clarion is playing the Loki archetype, then that means that Etrigan is playing the Thor archetype. This comparison is given additional depth when you realize that the relationship between both heroes to their human counterparts function in the same capacity. Merlin serves as our omniscient narrator, detailing the adventures of the demon and how they relate to the triumph of good over evil. He does appear in physical form multiple times throughout, but he's really just there to provide quests for Etrigan to carry out. Morgane Le Fay is an enchantress seeking power and youth, which is a continuation of her counterpart within Arthurian mythology, as Morgane Le Fay began as a protector of King Arthur, later an antagonist, and then became a symbol for moral ambiguity. An essay by Jessica Hines elaborates on Morgane Le Fay's characterization within mythology, stating, Morgane Le Fay speaks to her close association with the fairy world. The Fae, in Celtic and British folklore, were otherworldly beings of enormous power who were sources of both awe and danger, and encounters with them led to either great fortune or tragedy. Perhaps, like the Fae, Morgane's witchcraft was too powerful, too otherworldly, to be confined fully by human moral logic. Saving a person you've just spent years to destroy is sort of the thing the Fae would do. What is interesting is Merlin and Morgan only share one interaction on the page within Arthurian legend, as Morgan learns magic from Merlin. However, they're not directly tied in the ways that the demon portrays. Obviously, this is Kirby taking creative liberties and making sure that his work is differentiated from the mythology. It's just interesting to point out how these characters differ from their counterparts. Kirby didn't just utilize mythology either. In one of the pivotal stories, Kirby introduces Baron von Reichenstein, affectionately referred to as Baron von Evilstein, and he also has an assistant named Igor. This story adapts Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with an interesting twist. In the horror classic, Dr. Frankenstein operates on his subjects using science. However, within the pages of The Demon, Evilstein marries the occult and science to perform experimentations on his subjects. This allows for a wider perspective on the story, and also allows for this character to explore the correlation between magic and science. The most interesting aspect of The Demon is Kirby's subversion of expectations. In the story, it's depicted that Etrigan is a demon enacting the will of Merlin. Not only does a good demon sound like an oxymoron, but Kirby depicts the demon to have the heroics of the stereotypical knight in shining armor. The narrative showcases the threats plaguing humanity, and it utilizes Etrigan to vanquish these beasts, offsetting the imbalance between the good and the malevolent. Additionally, Kirby subverts the expectations of heroism within Etrigan. Etrigan is a grotesque creature embodying the physical traits of the devil. When most mythology depicts their heroes to have traditional beauty standards, that way being a reflection of their righteousness, Etrigan is the antithesis of that notion. While we're talking about subversion, we should really talk about Kirby subverting his own tropes. Etrigan is a specific archetype within comics where you have two identities within the same body. The easiest examples of these being the Hulk, a Kirby creation, Thor, like I mentioned earlier, a Kirby creation, and Captain Marvel. No, the other one, but that one works too. Typically, these will showcase a normal human gaining power and then also getting additional personality with that power. To break that down a little bit further, Bruce Banner is exposed to gamma radiation and becomes the Hulk. In The Demon, Kirby cements that Etrigan is the first identity, and it's only when he's casted out of Camelot does he develop the personality of Jason Blood, which is his human form. This type of subversion leads to an identity crisis within the series. At first, Jason is naive to the demon's existence, then becomes aware and afraid of the brutish nature that Etrigan embodies. It's only when Jason is informed by Merlin that Etrigan is the original that Jason grapples with the idea that he's just a demon's alter ego. Duality is a strong theme within this series, having Etrigan be impulsive and brutish, while Jason is reserved and civil. To exemplify this, in a dream, Etrigan and Blood are chained together, and after a monster appears, Etrigan pulls to kill the monster, while Jason attempts to pull away. Etrigan is seemingly the call to adventure, or just relying on base instincts. Jason is the embodiment of civility. It's as if his psyche is trying to rectify both identities within the same body, and one of those must yield for harmony to exist. In issue 8, Blood decides to use his Philosopher's Stone to rid himself of Etrigan, hoping to banish the demon out of his body. The issue shows his frustration and contemplation of how much of himself is truly human, and if his identity is only a guise for Etrigan to utilize as a vessel. Or in other words, am I a man or am I a demon? It should be noted that Jason's autonomy is stripped from him, either transforming into or transforming out of becoming Etrigan. The majority of the narrative shows Merlin forcing a transformation, and Jason's friend, Randu, is able to access the power to force Etrigan's change towards his human form. It's only in issue 5 when Jason is staring at certain death that he personally summons the demon for the first time. This provides Jason with the autonomy to make that choice to become Etrigan rather than having somebody else take that away from him. I just thought that was interesting. Anybody that's familiar with Jack Kirby's work would know that it's a steady flow of concepts. Within the pages of The Demon, there is a steady presence of these concepts, but they all have an interesting spin on their typical utilization. A new concept would be introduced from issue to issue, and then having the occult utilize it to amass control. Some of these examples include Somnambula, the Dream Beast, who magnifies our thoughts and makes them reality. The Reincarnators, who are a cult of the Master Eye and use magic and eye symbols to revert people into their ancestors. Kamara, the Fear Monster, who's able to transform into the embodiment of the worst fear of its victims. The Howler, which is a man much like Jason overtaken by the primal entity, making him a werewolf. The primal entity searches for a more suitable host while also currently draining its current host of life. The Soul Snatcher, a demon who snatches your soul. Okay, that's kind of self-explanatory, but it does so by stealing the face of its victims. There are, of course, much more examples, but these just really stood out to me as Kirby delving into Lovecraftian concepts and utilizing them to portray the deepest fears within us, or at least for me, starting some of these fears. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really wanted to cover this series as a whole because I feel like the majority of the coverage that I've seen personally just focuses on the first issue. Although I know that Kirby would have preferred to work on the fourth world, it's not totally apparent within these pages. Even while inconveniencing, Jack was able to expand DC's magic side and formulate an interesting character that'll become a fan favorite and a mainstay in the magic in DC. Alright, that's enough of me. If you like this video, you can go ahead and click that playlist, or if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. And don't forget, go read some comics, or else.